This is the Authentic Change Podcast, and I am Mike Horne. Authenticity reflects what we want from each other and our organizations: open communication, trust, community, fun, and opportunity. I want to help you to do your best in your personal and professional relationships. This podcast delivers expertise, insights, and approaches on authentic leadership, to live your purpose, to lead from your values, to establish connected relationships, to steward people and culture change, to build and sustain prosperity, and to open doors and possibilities. This podcast will assist you in paving the way forward to personal, team, and organizational prosperity. Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast with Mike Horne. I am delighted today to have as a guest John Ryan. John's a remarkable human being, and you'll want to know, how do I know this? It's because I've experienced John being on his podcast. John is president of John Ryan and Associates, and for over 20 years, he's educated and led and helped people prosper in their leadership and in their organizations. I am so delighted, John, to have you as a guest today on Authentic Change. Welcome.
Dr. Mike, thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, great. I rarely hear that honorific, Dr. Mike. So let's just go with the mic. It's a great way to, continue. John, tell our audience about yourself. Tell us about your work on increasing employee engagement, reducing turnover in organizations. You've just got so much behind you and what you've done and what you've contributed. Let's hear about it.
Sure. I think in the end, it comes down to, and I think this really relates to the audience on authentic communication. And I'll talk about how I got my start in just a moment. Of course, is beginning to know who you are, in relation to the vision of the organization that we have and we're organizing behind, and also creating a space to allow others to be authentic in their path and determining, is this the right fit for me? Because we find out all too quickly when people put their best foot forward, whether they're not a fit or whether they are a fit. And that time will tell when that happens. And that relates, I think, a little bit to me and finding my path and how I got involved in personal growth and development. When I first caught the bug, if you will, on helping people, it was, it wasn't from inspiration, it was more from desperation and wanting to turn things around. And I went to my first training in 1996, and I was like, this is what I want to do. And I got called to learning everything I can and growing and getting degrees and certifications and everything you possibly can do to help people improve their communication. And in the end, it really gets simple. It's, I imagine it has been for you, Mike. It's getting clear on who you are, where do you want to go, what do you stand for, and then helping other people do the same thing as we hopefully, adjourn together on this journey and this process called business, a family, relationship, whatever the context is. It's kind of the same work, is figuring out who you are and sticking true to those values.
That's so great, John, to describe it as similar work across social systems. It's a wonderful way to think about authenticity, though I am curious about what was the desperation that led you to the training?
Well, for me, it was, I was actually in college, and my first 2 years had a straight line descent in terms of academics. Started getting in trouble, and toxic relationship, as toxic as a 20-year-old can have, I suppose. And certainly could be worse. And my parents noticed and said, hey, we just attended this seminar, a personal growth and development seminar. We thought you might want to go. And I went. I had never been to a training before. And the thing I remember that really turned it around for me was something so simple that we all take for granted, which is goal setting. On day 1, day 2 of the training, we start talking about goal setting and SMART goals and all the standard stuff that you talk about in companies about objectives and how we're going to get there. And the question was, 5 years from now will arrive. The question is, where do you want to be when you get there? And when's the time to plan that out? And I'd never prior to that really thought about it. It was always just like, one simple decision, short-sighted after the other. The next step, school, high school, whatever, all the way through, and not really thinking about the long term. And then the whole world began to open up for me. I was like, no, this is what I want to do. And the vision showed up and I connected to it. And that's when I really started to go inside and who am I and who I want to be, and started kind of reevaluating things and getting clear. And I think it's still a process of discovering and rediscovering as time changes and context changes too.
Yeah, such a wonderful way to express it, John. This who am I? Not a who am I with certainty, but a who am I in terms of I am the person I am becoming. And to do that, while we have the wits to do that, while we have the smarts to do that, it makes it such a worthwhile endeavor, I think, on this road of figuring out who am I and who am I to you. So, John, in all of this work that you've done, whether it's your written work, whether it's your platform work as a trainer, as a speaker, as a consultant, speaker, author, trainer, authenticity has to come up in at least one or two situations, particularly over 20 years. Can you, how do you begin to describe it? I mean, how do you understand it?
I certainly will defer to your expertise, but I'm happy to provide my own thoughts and to further the discussion and help me illuminate, my gaps as well. I know we talked briefly on our podcast where you came on my show, and I'm happy to report that's coming out this week. I know probably a delay, but in the past, you'll go back and check it out. It's amazing stuff. And we brought up this conversation around authenticity, and it doesn't necessarily give you a license to, disrespect others or to be a jerk, as it were. And I think authenticity for me, as I see it, is doing that inner work and discovering who I am. So in the field of neurolinguistic programming, which has been the bulk of my adult life and exploring psychology and things like that, values are considered some of the deepest level of our programming that drives our beliefs, that drives our decisions and our behaviors all the way through attitudes and opinions and things like that. And not that it's discrete on a spectrum, but there's certainly a variability in conscious and unconsciousness there. And knowing what your values are first and foremost helps you have a clarity in what drives me, what fulfills me. Because we can have success from an outside perspective in terms of monetary, but not be fulfilled. We can have, from the outside perspective, the Facebook or the social media life where it looks like we're living it, but not really truly have happiness because we're not being who we're meant to be. The idea of be, do, and have, well, having is a byproduct of doing, and doing is a byproduct of being. So if you really want to be your best, the way we look at it in the conversations we have in my work is to drill down into those values. What are those values? Where do they come from? Are they in alignment? Is there conflict inside of that? And even deeper, the motivation for one value could be largely towards, or could also be away from. And so if we're operating from an away from mentality, we're driven by the lack of it rather than the pursuit of it. So someone might say, I want money as a value in the context of career, and wanting money to do good things with it is very different from I'm afraid of not having any. And the energy we show up is more of a lack mentality versus an abundance mentality. And just as one example.
Yeah, it's really wonderful work. I mean, I think about values as shaping individual, interpersonal, and organization behavior. And I often think that values are selective, right? That we choose our values, subject to a lot of environmental conditioning. And that's why I loved your questions about, where do they arise? How are they shaped? But so, for example, understanding that relational values can be just as important to one individual as accreting values are to another individual. And sorting out those values, I don't think we often speak out loud about them and what the influences were. Or is that your experience as well? Is it something new when you're approaching people?
There are probably levels. I think we probably agree that there are levels of awareness of values. And so we have sometimes a superficial relationship to what really drives us. And in the end, it's not what we say that's important. It's what we really do when push comes to shove that determines what our values and our priorities of those values really are. And then on top of that is the meaning ascribed to that value. So even more important than the word. Like if you think about a corporation doing values, we value integrity and customer service and all those kind of buzzwords that could be in there.
Integrity.
Yeah, the list. So cut and paste, and you can give it to any organization and go from there. But who cares? It's just a word. It's the meaning. It's the picture that's behind that, and the meaning about how do you operationalize that into the doing. And how do you show up to fulfill that value? And that's where it really becomes unconscious that we don't really spend a lot of time with in thinking. And once we do, the playbook is in front of us in terms of fulfillment, success, and happiness.
I operate from a set of humanistic values, respect for the individual, dignity in life, thinking about growing inclusion by having diverse people and ideas around yourself. All of these is a way to bring more of who I am to what I do. So understanding those values is important. And when people discuss their authentic selves with you or with a member of your team and talk about leading authentically, what do you think some of the values are behind those, if you could identify them?
It's going to vary. I have found that it definitely varies. I like to think that the humanistic values that you just started to describe are somewhat universal to leaders, and that the really good leaders show up at the top that value people. They value communication. They value integrity and honesty and openness to ideas and things like that. Not all people feel that way, and certainly, but I think those are certainly a reasonable base to start from if you were to have to do a mind read on like, hey, what is someone who's on the path of doing the inner work to help other people do the inner work so we can produce something greater than ourselves. I think those are probably a good framework to start with for sure.
Right. I was thinking about those, values, passion, integrity, courage, which are often found in many value statements. In many cases, as we learned, they don't mean much. Whether you go back and go to the Wayback Machine with Enron and integrity being the number one value, or you have a more recent examples at Wells Fargo, at United Airlines. So I don't think people talk enough about this sort of stuff, and I think it drives so much behavior. And I wonder to what extent, we just ascribe unknowingly to the values of an organization without much, thought or forethought.
I think there's a lot of pressure once you join an organization to go along with that flow. We like to think of ourselves as individuals that we're going to do right by our values and that we're going to stand up to the little guy. But, time and time again, and maybe this is shifting. I'm hoping this is shifting with the change in the makeup of our workforce. And 2025, there's going to be a huge force of millennials out there, and that individualistic ideals, perhaps that will also continue to shift and have greater responsibility, greater ecology in the larger sense. Because when we ascribe to certain values, then all of a sudden there's something to lose by going against those values. To be that person who's on the outside, the marginal man who's part of the group but not quite part of the group, and it can be a man or a woman, of course, to then call out a leader or a fellow worker, employee for not fulfilling those values, there's a big risk. Because what if then the person in HR or your manager then says, well, you're no longer part of us, and all of a sudden you start getting kicked out of the organization?
I wonder if you have any observations on this. In organizations, particularly in large organizations, there are many lists. There are lists of leadership behaviors, or there are lists of corporate values. There are lists of performance standards. So I think it becomes often a very cloudy picture or a murky sea for which the manager has to operate. So how do we, help individuals clarify or align or sift through all of these things in relationship to their values? I suppose it requires some organizational commitment to do that, but wonder what you think the drivers might be for the individual to blend and immerse themselves, him or her, or themselves in those ideas.
Well, the first thing that came to mind is you're mentioning the list, the spreadsheets, or the database. So these are the values, and it's how it gets operationalized. If it's too much, it's just too much, and people can't. It's too nebulous. You want to get more specific. And what are the top three? So when I do values work with an executive, we'll list out, hey, what's important to you as a leader, and we'll have 10 to 20 things. And then we'll operationalize the top 5.
Yeah.
Because the top 5 are doable, they're manageable. And then as you have the corporate values, let's say you isolate that endless list into a 5, then on your one-on-ones, in your group meetings, these have to be brought up into that culture on a consistent basis. It's the old idea, people don't do what we expect, they do what we inspect. And if you're not going to bring it up again and tie this to my performance and ask me questions about how am I incorporating value number 1, value number 2, and value number 3, how am I demonstrating this, then it's just lip service and rather than in action, which is really what we really want.
Such a powerful endorsement for the consistency of communication of values in an organization. I'm familiar with one executive, a person with whom I had a reporting relationship, an executive vice president for human resources in a Fortune 100 corporation. And consistently, she had the same message in almost every public event around the values that she and the organization were shaping. And I think it's one of the things that distinguish her for me as a superior leader. It is that, matching your actions and your words, though, that really comes to bear on that. But providing these pathways. And John, what I'm wondering is, I think we align on the idea that by fostering open communication and by fostering communication, trust, and openness, we build better work environments. In fact, it's the foundation for authentic leadership. At least I think that. And the relationship to integrity is inextricable, right? If I don't trust you, I won't think you have integrity. And if I don't think you have integrity, I surely won't trust you. So how do we begin to, work this very basic yet value I think that we all strive for, which is to create these kinds of trusting environments which result in psychological safety and, all the outcomes that we know about? How do we do it?
I think we have to. I love when you mentioned that initial story about the person who came back with the same message over and over and over again. That created consistency. That consistency creates familiarity, creates a sense of trust. And why can't we all individually get clear on and not just be over reductionistic about getting clear on your values and your beliefs and what do you stand for, but what is your message as a leader? And then how can you weave that in? Not that it's one size fits all, but if this one theme is there, they know what you stand for, and that begins to seep in because it just becomes pervasive.
Sure. And as work changes or work platforms change, right? People work remotely, people work variable hours, all ushered in or accelerated by the COVID pandemic. And as we enter these other phases, an endemic phase, perhaps, I don't think the things that we talk about in the workplace, in the work world, because maybe it's the work world as opposed to the workplace, in the work world, these things don't change about communication, trust, and openness. At least I don't think so. You've got to figure out different ways to do that. But I'm wondering if you have any ideas on that, John, and how that, the new world of work for many is shaping those things we value and hold so dearly.
We've been having a lot of conversations around these exact kind of topics, and the platform will change. The way we communicate will continue to evolve. The principles of effectiveness, the principles of authenticity and leadership, those I feel are timeless. You look at, Stephen Covey's work, still stands the test of time. You look at Ray Dalio, Principles in of itself, amazing golden nuggets that you could feed on for a lifetime in his wisdom and knowledge. And those things will adapt. And the question is, how do I take this lattice work of different ideas and concepts and mold them into and use them in this specific context with independent workforce, organizations, and remote workers, et cetera? It's how do we take the principles and apply them in the new context?
Mm-hmm. And how do you think, what will you be doing with managers? Because managers, as we know, control so much of employee engagement. How will you be leveraging, or what ideas will you be leveraging in the work that John Ryan and Associates does to increase engagement and stop talent and knowledge drain that happens when people leave?
To increase engagement and really to create buy-in, right, which is what we're kind of talking about. Of course, you got to have the vision. You have to get clear on how you relate to that vision, and also have real conversations with people and connect to what is their why. Because the vision of the organization has to be big enough that they can fulfill their why. If it doesn't connect like that, they're not going to be there long term. And right. If you don't have that relationship and help them stay connected to their why and see how their vision fits into the larger vision of the organization or the team or the department, then there's no relationship. And people don't quit organizations, they quit bosses. And it's quite often because they don't feel valued, respected, and there's no relationship there.
If you were, in your observation of so many managers and leaders across the U.S. and around the world, if you had any key insights or observations around those with whom you've engaged and interacted with, who demonstrate and flourish with the use of authentic leadership, understanding self in relationship to others, what advice or comments or what lessons would you share with others?
I think one of the words that comes up right now is vulnerability, and being willing to share the mistakes, to share the learnings, and to create that space, because we all know that the larger organization, the easier it is to hide mistakes and hide issues, but that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is still there. It's not being handled. So creating that vulnerability, creating that space, and at the same time, developing a relationship of trust for that to happen. When you share a struggle, which is not our strength, by the way, in our society, we want to hide those mistakes. We don't want to know. Some people look at it as a weakness. It's not a weakness. It takes a great amount of strength to share a vulnerability or a challenge that you've been through, and creating that self-accountability mindset. Because when we do that, we can own up to our mistakes. Hey, here's what happened. I need your help, or here's how I'm solving it, and kind of creating that family, if you will.
Right. That's a way that we can use it as a metaphor, as an analogy for accomplishing work in groups, in organizations. And John, as you work with others and see them succeeding with their authenticity and bringing more of who they are to what they do, how do we support that in individuals? What has to remain in an organization to support growth and development?
What has to remain in the organization to support growth and development of the managers or the teams?
Of authentic leadership. So, you get someone who has a great idea. Let's have lots of development or learning opportunities for people on a certain subject. What happened? It's often said that the most difficult part of a one-day training is the second day, right? Where people have to implement and do things and maybe carry out some new behaviors. What suggestions do you give to leaders to support the kind of work that we're talking about? What do we do environmentally?
Thanks for clarifying.
No.
100%. It's not just information. The answer is not just in a book. It's not just in a training. It's embodying the values, the beliefs, the accountability, the vulnerability, and getting clarity on what you stand for as an organization, and then really bringing that into the room. So it's not just in a training room or a book or a one-time discussion, but it's something that you live and breathe, like that executive you mentioned who had that same message over and over again. If it becomes like a broken record, awesome. You know you're doing a good job in that regard and communicating those values. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so wonderful is to have that accountability to a certain set of principles or to a certain set of values, perhaps, to which everyone can align, and that others support the work that goes towards that. A wonderful challenge to have, I think. Timeless issues, perhaps, in new environments for us, and I'm so grateful, as I suspect you are, to have this opportunity to help and to work with others individually and in their teams and in their groups, so that we increase the capacity for people to bring their talents to what they do.
100%. Yeah, it's very rewarding. And I love hearing the feedback when, like, the initiative of a leader, it gets carried out and the culture begins to shift over time and people start embodying the values, and you're not having to do it for them or to remind them. It just has an inertia on its own. Very, very cool to see.
So wonderful as a way to think about authentic leadership and authentic change, and the elements that conspire and inspire us to change authentically as well. But more on that to come. John, it's so wonderful. How do people get in touch with you?
Simplest way, johnryanleadership.com. Connect with me on social media there. If you put free after it, you'll find all the free resources, and do trainings every week on Facebook if you're interested in checking that out as well. So johnryanleadership.com/free would be a good way to go.
Oh, that's just great. johnryanleadership.com free.
Exactly. Slash free.
Yeah. And it's just wonderful because what listeners will discover is just a wealth of resources that John makes available, both in a live setting and with print media, all kinds. So I encourage you to visit johnryanleadership.com and all the resources there if you type in the /free as well. So, John, thank you so much for being a guest today, and just thanks.
Mike, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And to our audience, until the next episode of Authentic Leadership, stay well. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll subscribe today and tell a friend about our show. If you're looking for hands-on help to increase your success through authentic change, or have a question you'd like to hear me answer here, please email me at mike@mike-horne.com.